It was just another ordinary morning when a man in his mid-30s decided to take his usual walk around the neighborhood. He always enjoyed the quiet and calm of the early hours before the day truly began. The streets were still, save for the occasional birdsong and the soft rustling of leaves in the breeze. As he walked, he passed the usual spots, the same bakery he visited on weekends, the corner cafe, the small park where children played after school. But today, something felt different. As he approached a small intersection near the park, he noticed a police car parked along the curb. The officer sitting in the driver's seat had his window down, and the man thought nothing of it at first. But as he got closer, he could hear the officer's voice raised in anger. It wasn't just a typical police tone. There was something about it that made the man uneasy. His instincts told him something wasn't quite right. He slowed his pace, curiosity getting the best of him. The officer was talking to a young couple standing at the edge of the park. The man couldn't make out all the words, but he could tell the officer was interrogating them. The couple appeared nervous, looking from one another to the officer, unsure of how to respond. The officer's body language was intimidating. He stood tall, arms crossed, leaning into them in a way that felt like a warning. The man hesitated for a moment. He considered turning around, but something inside him urged him to stay. He wasn't someone who liked confrontation, but today, for some reason, he felt compelled to find out what was going on. He stepped closer, hoping to hear more clearly. As he did, the officer turned his attention toward him. The young couple quickly took a few steps back, leaving the man alone with the officer. The officer's eyes narrowed as he looked him up and down, his expression darkening. "What are you looking at?" the officer barked, his voice harsh and full of authority. The man blinked, taken aback by the sudden aggression. He hadn't meant to intrude. He was simply curious. I just wondered if everything was all right," he stammered, trying to keep his voice calm. The officer's jaw tightened. "Mind your own business," he snapped. "This doesn't concern you." The man took a step back, surprised by the officer's sudden hostility. But before he could retreat, the officer took a step forward, blocking his path. "Do you have a problem with authority?" the officer growled. The man didn't know how to respond. He had no intention of making trouble, but something about the officer's tone made him uncomfortable. He took another cautious step back. "I wasn't trying to cause any trouble," he said, his voice quiet. The officer's eyes narrowed even further. "Well, you're causing trouble now, aren't you?" With that, the officer pushed the man, not with much force but enough to make him stumble. The man's heart raced as he tried to regain his balance. This wasn't what he had expected when he set out for his morning walk. "Look, I'm just trying to get by," the man said, his voice shaking slightly as he tried to de-escalate the situation. But the officer wasn't hearing it. He took another step toward him, his face inches from the man's. "I'm warning you," the officer spat, his breath hot on the man's face. "You don't ask questions. You don't poke around where you're not wanted." The man was taken aback by the sudden hostility. "I didn't mean any harm. I was just curious." The officer shook his head as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Curious? You think you can just ask me questions like you're some sort of journalist?" He sneered. "You don't talk to me like that." Before the man could respond, the officer's fist flew at him, landing squarely in his stomach. The air whooshed out of the man's lungs as he doubled over, pain shooting through his body. He gasped for air, feeling disoriented. His knees buckled and he hit the ground hard. For a moment, everything was a blur. The man struggled to catch his breath as he lay on the pavement, stunned and disoriented. His stomach burned from the blow, and he could taste the metallic tang of blood in his mouth. The officer stood over him, glaring down with an intensity that made the man feel small and powerless. "You're lucky I don't arrest you right here," the officer sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "Next time, keep your nose out of things that don't concern you." The crowd that had gathered at a distance whispered in shock, but no one moved to intervene. The man's vision was fuzzy, and he couldn't quite make sense of what was happening. This wasn't just a routine interaction with a police officer. This felt personal. Still trying to regain his bearings, the man pushed himself up, his hands trembling as he used the sidewalk to help him stand. He wiped his mouth, his mind racing. Why had the officer reacted like that? It was as though the officer had something to hide, as if he was afraid of being questioned. But the man knew he couldn't just let it go. He had to find out what was going on, if only for his own peace of mind. The officer didn't give him the chance to ask another question. "Get out of here," the officer barked. "I don't want to see you around here again." Shaken and in pain, the man walked away, his head spinning. He could still feel the sting of the officer's punch, but what disturbed him more was the way the officer had acted. He had seen enough in his life to recognize an abuse of power when he saw one. But why had the officer been so angry? What was the officer hiding? And why had he reacted so violently to a simple question? As he walked, the man couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a random encounter. There was something deeper at play here. He had seen police officers in action before, and most of them were professional. But this officer, Officer Thompson, was different. His anger had seemed disproportionate, like he was covering something up. The man made a silent vow to find out more. He had to know the truth behind Officer Thompson's aggression. The man couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. As the days passed after his unsettling encounter with Officer Thompson, he found himself replaying the incident over and over in his mind. The officer's words, his actions, they didn't add up. The way Thompson had reacted to his simple question had left him feeling uneasy, and the punch that followed seemed like it wasn't just about the moment. It was something deeper, something hidden beneath the surface. It wasn't long before the man decided that he couldn't just let it go. He needed answers. At first, he considered letting the matter fade away, figuring that it was just an isolated event, a bad encounter with a hot-headed officer. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that it wasn't just about him. What if Officer Thompson was acting out of some sense of unchecked power, using his badge to intimidate others? The man had seen the officer's anger up close, and it wasn't just about him asking a question. No, there was something more to it. He decided to dig deeper, to look into Thompson's history. It wasn't something he usually did. He wasn't the kind of person who got involved in things like this. But this time he felt like he had no choice. He couldn't allow an officer to get away with what seemed like a pattern of behavior, especially not when it had turned violent. The man began his search quietly, not wanting to draw attention to his efforts. He knew that looking into a police officer's background wasn't exactly something the average citizen did every day. But he had seen enough of the world to understand that sometimes the truth didn't just come to light on its own. You had to go looking for it. He started by researching the local police department. It didn't take long before he discovered that Officer Thompson had been part of the force for over a decade. From the outside, it seemed like he was a well-respected officer. He had a reputation for being tough and unyielding, someone who didn't back down from a confrontation. But as the man dug deeper, he found reports of incidents where Thompson's behavior seemed to cross the line. There were stories of people who had been stopped for minor infractions, only to be subjected to unnecessary force or harsh questioning. It was subtle at first, just little things like using intimidating language or making veiled threats. But as the man went further, he found something that made his stomach drop. There were allegations of racial profiling. The man felt a wave of disbelief wash over him. He had suspected that something wasn't right, but this was more than he had bargained for. The deeper he dug, the more he found. And it painted a picture of a man who had been getting away with behavior that bordered on abusive. It wasn't just about the punch he had received. It was about a pattern of behavior that had gone unnoticed by those around him. As the man continued his search, he came across an old news article that caught his eye. It was about a case where a young black man had been stopped by Officer Thompson. The article described how the man had been questioned for no apparent reason, and when he asked why he was being detained, Officer Thompson had become aggressive. The man in the article had even claimed that Thompson had used racial slurs during the exchange. The article didn't go into much detail, but it was enough for the man to understand that this wasn't the first time Thompson had let his prejudices take control. The more the man read, the more it became clear that Officer Thompson's behavior wasn't an isolated incident. It wasn't just one bad day, one angry outburst. This was a pattern, a history of abuse and discrimination that had been overlooked for far too long. The man began to feel a sense of responsibility, not just to himself, but to the community. If he didn't do something, then who would? He couldn't just sit back and pretend like nothing had happened. He knew that taking action wouldn't be easy. It would take courage, and it might even put him at odds with people he had known for years. But the thought of letting someone like Officer Thompson continue to abuse his power was worse than the discomfort he might feel from standing up to him. The man began to draft a formal complaint. He wanted to make sure that every detail was covered, that the facts were presented clearly and concisely. He knew that his testimony could make a difference, but he also understood that he wasn't the only one who had been affected by Thompson's actions. There had to be others, victims who had been too scared or too intimidated to speak up. But the man wasn't naive. He knew that bringing attention to Thompson's actions could have consequences. The police force was a tight-knit community, and standing up against one of their own could lead to backlash. He didn't want to become a target, but at the same time he couldn't sit idly by. He had to do what was right. As he finished writing the complaint, the man sat back and took a deep breath. It felt like a monumental decision. He wasn't just exposing one officer's wrongdoing. He was potentially starting a ripple effect that could change the way the police force operated. The idea of being part of something bigger, of helping to bring about change, gave him a sense of purpose. But he also understood the weight of the situation. It was no longer just about him. It was about the community, about the people who lived in fear of officers like Thompson. It was about justice. Before he submitted the complaint, the man took a moment to consider the possibilities. What would happen if the police department ignored it? What would happen if they tried to cover up the truth? And what if they retaliated against him for speaking out? The fear was real, but so was the desire to see things change. He decided to go ahead with it. He filed the complaint and sent it to the department, knowing that once it was in their hands, there would be no turning back. As he clicked the send button, a feeling of both relief and anxiety washed over him. He had done what he believed was right, and now he had to wait. He wasn't sure what the outcome would be, but he knew one thing for certain. Things couldn't stay the same. Over the next few days, he anxiously waited for a response. He didn't hear anything at first, and that only made him more nervous. Had the department even received his complaint? Was it being brushed aside like so many others? The uncertainty gnawed at him, but he reminded himself that he had done his part. He had spoken up, but then a phone call came. It was from the local news station. They had caught wind of the complaint, and they wanted to hear his side of the story. The man was hesitant at first. Was he ready to go public with this? Would it make things worse? But as the conversation continued, he realized that this was his chance to make a real difference. He agreed to an interview, unsure of where it would lead, but knowing that he had to take the next step. His actions, his voice, maybe, just maybe, they could help change things for the better. The phone call from the news station had left the man feeling a mix of excitement and apprehension. He wasn't sure what to expect, but as he prepared for the interview, his mind raced with questions. Would he be able to tell his story clearly? What if the media twisted his words? What if Officer Thompson's supporters turned on him? The morning of the interview, the man sat in front of his kitchen table, his hands trembling slightly as he poured himself a cup of coffee. He'd never been in the spotlight before, and the thought of sharing such a personal experience with the world made him feel vulnerable. But deep down, he knew that this was his chance to speak up for those who had been silenced, to stand up against an officer who had taken advantage of his power for far too long. As the time for the interview approached, the man tried to calm his nerves. He reminded himself that he wasn't just speaking for himself. He was speaking for anyone who had ever been treated unjustly. His voice could make a difference. The more he thought about it, the more determined he became. He wasn't going to let fear stop him. When the reporter arrived at his house, the man was surprised by how professional and calm they were. The news team didn't seem interested in sensationalizing his story. They wanted to hear the truth. The reporter, a woman in her 30s, introduced herself and set up her equipment in the living room. She asked the man to sit in front of the camera and speak about what had happened with Officer Thompson. The first question was simple. Can you tell us what happened the day you were stopped by Officer Thompson? The man took a deep breath before responding. He had rehearsed this in his mind 1,000 times, but now that the moment was here, it was different. His words needed to carry weight. I was just walking through the neighborhood like I do every morning, he began. I noticed an Officer Thompson talking to a couple near the park. At first, I didn't think anything of it. But when I got closer, I could tell something wasn't right. The officer was asking them questions in a way that felt invasive. He paused, trying to find the right words. I asked him what was going on, just out of curiosity. I thought maybe the couple needed help or maybe there was something I didn't know. But instead of answering, he got angry. He told me to mind my own business, and when I tried to explain that I wasn't trying to cause trouble, he punched me. Just like that. The reporter nodded, her expression serious. How did that make you feel? The man's gaze dropped to his hands. He could still feel the sting of the punch in his gut, the way his breath had left him in an instant. It felt like I didn't matter, like I was just some inconvenience to him. I had done nothing wrong, and yet he took out his frustration on me. He looked up at the reporter, his voice steady now. But it wasn't just about me. It was about the way he treated people, the way he abused his power. I couldn't just let that go. The reporter paused for a moment, clearly processing his words. She then asked, "So you decided to file a complaint?" The man nodded. Yeah, at first I wasn't sure what good it would do. I knew he had a reputation in the department. People respected him, even feared him, but I couldn't stay quiet. I started looking into his history, and that's when I realized this wasn't just a one-time thing. He had done this before, used his badge to intimidate people, to hurt them, and I knew I had to say something. The reporter's tone softened. "What did you find when you looked into his background?" The man took another deep breath. "I found stories of him being rough with people, treating them like they were less than him. There were reports of him pulling people over for no reason, questioning them in ways that made them uncomfortable. And then there were the rumors, the ones that said he had a history of being racist. It wasn't just that he was aggressive. It was the way he singled out certain people. I don't know how much of it was true, but I couldn't ignore it." The reporter nodded again, her voice calm. "And after you filed the complaint, what happened?" The man looked down for a moment, unsure how to continue. "Nothing at first. I didn't hear anything for days, maybe weeks. I started to wonder if anyone was even taking me seriously. But then out of nowhere I heard that Officer Thompson had been promoted. He was made chief of police." The words hung in the air for a moment, and the reporter's eyes widened. "Wait, you're telling me that after everything that happened, he was promoted?" "Yeah," the man said, his voice tinged with disbelief. "He was made chief. I couldn't believe it. After all the complaints, after everything I found about him, they gave him more power. It felt like a slap in the face." The reporter leaned forward, clearly engaged. "How did that make you feel?" "It made me feel like nothing would change," the man said, shaking his head. "Like the system was broken and that people like him could get away with anything." It was hard not to lose hope. But then, I started thinking about all the other people who had been hurt by him. I couldn't just sit back and do nothing. I had to do something. The reporter paused before asking, "Did you consider going public with this before the news interview?" The man thought for a moment before responding. "I did, but I was scared. I didn't know what would happen if I did. What if I was targeted for speaking out? What if they tried to discredit me or worse? But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that silence wasn't going to make anything better. I wasn't just standing up for myself, I was standing up for everyone who had been afraid to speak out against him." He leaned back in his chair, his expression firm. "That's why I agreed to talk to you. I'm not doing this for fame or recognition. I'm doing it because I believe things need to change. People need to know that this kind of behavior, abuse of power, racism, has no place in our communities. And if no one speaks out, it'll just keep happening." The reporter smiled, a small but sincere gesture. "Thank you for sharing your story. Your courage could inspire others to come forward too." The man nodded, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. He wasn't sure what the future would hold, but he knew that by sharing his experience, he was taking a step toward change. The interview ended soon after, and the reporter promised to follow up with him if there were any developments. In the days that followed, the man felt a mixture of emotions: relief, nervousness, and hope. His story had gone public, and it was out of his hands now. He knew that what happened next could go in any direction. He had no idea how the public or the police department would react, but he was ready to face whatever came. He kept watching the news, hoping for some sign that things were beginning to change. And then, just as he was starting to lose faith, he saw a news report that would turn everything around. The department had announced an investigation into Officer Thompson's conduct. It wasn't over yet, but it was a step in the right direction. The news of the investigation was a relief, but it wasn't a victory yet. The man, now more than ever, felt the weight of his decision to speak out, while part of him was glad that the truth was being acknowledged. Another part of him wondered just how far the investigation would go. Would Officer Thompson really be held accountable, or would the system protect one of its own? For the next few days, the man kept a close eye on the news. He watched as the story about the investigation gained traction. Journalists from various outlets were now digging into Officer Thompson's history, interviewing former colleagues and citizens who had witnessed his behavior. Slowly, the narrative began to shift. No longer was Officer Thompson the respected, tough officer who was known for enforcing the law. Now he was under scrutiny, his actions exposed for the public to see. The man began to feel a strange sense of validation. For the first time, it seemed like the truth was finally coming to light. He wasn't the only one speaking up now. Other people who had been too afraid to come forward before were reaching out to share their experiences. Some of them had been stopped by Officer Thompson for no reason at all. Others had been subjected to rude, degrading comments. And then there were those who, like the man, had been physically threatened or hurt by him. Each new story confirmed what he had suspected all along. Officer Thompson had been abusing his position for years. And now the man realized he wasn't just taking a stand for himself, he was taking a stand for all of them. For everyone who had been affected by Thompson's actions, whether they had spoken out or not. Despite the growing momentum, the man still felt uneasy. He had never sought out public attention, and now it seemed like his life was under a microscope. His neighbors, his friends, even his coworkers, he wondered what they were all thinking. Had they seen the interview? Were they judging him? But even as those doubts crept in, he knew that he couldn't back down. He had made his decision and there was no going back. The fight was bigger than him now. It was about standing up for what was right, no matter the cost. Then, one morning, the phone rang. The man picked it up, his heart racing slightly, unsure of who it was. It was an unfamiliar number. "Hello?" he answered. "Is this the man who filed the complaint against Officer Thompson?" The voice on the other end was stern but polite. "Yes," he said, his throat dry. "Who is this?" "This is Detective Adams with the Internal Affairs Department. We've been following up on the investigation into Officer Thompson. I'd like to speak with you in person." The man's mind raced. This was it. The moment he had been waiting for, but also the moment he had feared. Was this the beginning of real change, or was it just another round of empty promises? He agreed to meet with the detective, setting up a time and place to talk. When the day of the meeting arrived, the man felt a mix of anticipation and dread. He wasn't sure what to expect. But as he sat in the waiting room of the Internal Affairs Office, he couldn't help but wonder if this was where everything would finally be decided. Would Officer Thompson face the consequences of his actions, or would the system protect him once again? A few minutes later, the door opened and Detective Adams walked in. He was a middle-aged man, wearing a suit that seemed slightly too formal for the setting. He shook the man's hand and gestured for him to sit. "Thanks for meeting with me," Detective Adams said, his voice calm but serious. "I know this isn't easy, but we need to get as much information as possible." The man nodded. "I understand. We've been speaking with other people who've had encounters with Officer Thompson," the detective continued. "It seems like there's a pattern of behavior that we can no longer ignore. But we need your testimony to make sure we have everything we need to move forward." The man hesitated for a moment, then spoke. "I've already told my story. I've been as honest as I can be. But I'm worried that nothing will come of this. Thompson is in a position of power. What if he gets away with it again?" Detective Adams looked at him with a mixture of understanding and determination. "I won't lie to you, this won't be easy. But the fact that you've come forward, that others are now coming forward as well, gives us a strong case. We won't stop until we've done everything we can to make sure justice is served." The man let out a breath, feeling a little bit of the weight lift off his shoulders. It wasn't over yet. But hearing those words made him believe that maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. As the investigation continued, the man kept a low profile, only speaking with the detective and his lawyer. The media, however, was relentless, constantly covering the story and speculating about what might happen next. The pressure on the department was growing, and the man knew that they couldn't ignore it much longer. A few weeks later, the department made an announcement. Officer Thompson was being placed on administrative leave while the investigation continued. The department stated that they were taking the allegations seriously and would do everything they could to ensure a fair and thorough process. It wasn't a decision that offered much certainty, but it was a sign that things were moving forward. Despite the progress, the man still felt a sense of unease. He knew that the system wasn't perfect. He had seen enough corruption and cover-ups to understand that sometimes, even when the truth was right in front of people, they chose to look the other way. But as he thought back on his decision to speak out, he realized that he had done the right thing. He couldn't control what others would do, but he could control his own actions. One day, a few weeks after Thompson had been placed on leave, the man received another call. This time it was from his lawyer. "They've made a decision," the lawyer said. "Thompson has been officially suspended, and the department is moving forward with disciplinary action." The man's heart skipped a beat. He had been bracing himself for a less favorable outcome, but this was what he had hoped for. Officer Thompson wasn't going to get away with it this time, but the lawyer wasn't finished. "There's more," they said. "The department has also announced that they're reviewing their entire disciplinary process. They want to make sure that something like this doesn't happen again." The man let out a long breath. For the first time in weeks, he felt like he could relax. This wasn't just about one officer. This was about holding the system accountable, about making sure that no one else would have to go through what he had. He didn't know what the future would bring, but in that moment, he felt a glimmer of hope. The fight wasn't over, but maybe, just maybe, things were starting to change. The days following the suspension of Officer Thompson were a whirlwind. The man, once just an ordinary citizen, found himself at the center of a story that had captured the attention of the entire community. He had never expected things to escalate this far, but now that they had, he felt a mixture of pride and anxiety. The fight was far from over, and though things were looking better, he knew that the road ahead would still be difficult. He spent most of his time following the news and checking in with his lawyer. The investigation was progressing, and each day brought new developments. Officer Thompson was still suspended, and the department had pledged to conduct a thorough review of the case. The pressure on the department was mounting, and the man couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. What if the powers that be decided to protect Thompson after all? What if the truth was buried once again? The man couldn't push those thoughts out of his mind, no matter how hard he tried. The fear of retaliation still lingered in the back of his mind. He didn't know if he was safe. And even though the investigation was moving forward, there were moments when he questioned whether he had done the right thing. Had he stirred up something that was too big for him to handle? He had hoped that justice would prevail, but what if he had overestimated the system? One evening, as the man sat on his porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, his phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number. He hesitated for a moment before answering, wondering who it could be. "Hello?" he said, his voice guarded. "Is this the man who filed the complaint against Officer Thompson?" the voice on the other end asked. "Yes, this is him," the man replied, his heart skipping a beat. The tone in the voice seemed official, but he wasn't sure what to expect. "I'm Detective Adams," the voice continued. "I just wanted to update you on the investigation. We've made some significant progress and we're moving toward a final decision." The man's stomach tightened. "What does that mean? Is there any news about Thompson?" "There is," Detective Adams said. "We've gathered enough evidence to move forward with formal charges. The department is taking this very seriously, and Thompson will be facing disciplinary action. I can't go into all the details yet, but I wanted you to know that your efforts have made a real difference." For the first time in weeks, the man felt a surge of relief. He had feared that the whole situation would fizzle out, that Thompson would escape without consequences. But now there was hope. Real, tangible hope. "I thank you," the man said, his voice thick with emotion. "I can't tell you how much this means. I've been worried, but hearing this, it makes me believe that maybe things can change." Detective Adams' voice softened. "You've done the right thing. You've been brave, and you've helped bring attention to something that needed to be addressed. But there's still more work to do. The department is committed to making sure this doesn't happen again, but it'll take time." The man nodded, his mind racing. This was the breakthrough he had been waiting for, but the journey wasn't over. There was still so much to be done, and he knew that the investigation would continue to unfold in the coming months. But for the first time, he felt like the truth was on his side. The system might not be perfect, but it was showing signs of change. Over the next few weeks, the man found himself thrust into a new kind of life. He was still an ordinary person, but now, everyone seemed to know his name. The local news outlets followed up on the investigation, and reporters continued to reach out for interviews. He was even invited to speak at a community meeting about the importance of holding public officials accountable. It was overwhelming, but he also felt a deep sense of purpose. He began to realize that this wasn't just about his own experience, it was about something much bigger. The community had been silent for too long, afraid of speaking out against the people who were supposed to protect them. But now, thanks to the growing momentum, people were starting to find their voices. Others who had been victims of Officer Thompson's actions came forward, telling their stories and joining in the fight for justice. The man had always believed that things could change, but he had never imagined that his own actions could spark such a shift. He had started with a single complaint, a single question, and now he was part of a movement that was slowly but surely making its mark on the community. But the fight was not without its challenges. As the investigation drew to a close, the pressure on Officer Thompson increased. There were still some who defended him, arguing that he had been unfairly targeted. The man knew that it wasn't going to be easy to bring about real change, but he was willing to fight for it. For himself, for the victims, and for the community that had been affected by Thompson's behavior. One day, the man received another call from Detective Adams. This time, the tone in the detective's voice was more serious. "We've reached a decision," Detective Adams said. "Officer Thompson has been officially terminated from the department. The disciplinary board has reviewed the evidence, and they've concluded that his actions were not only a violation of department policy, but also a violation of the trust that the public places in law enforcement." The man's heart raced as he processed the words. Thompson had been fired. It was a moment of victory, but it was also a reminder of the long road it had taken to get here. He had spoken up and his voice had been heard. But it wasn't just about one officer's downfall. It was about the system recognizing that abuse of power could not be tolerated. "I never thought this day would come," the man said, his voice thick with emotion. "I thought maybe nothing would change, but this feels like a real victory." "It is," Detective Adams replied, "but it's just the beginning. The department is implementing new policies to prevent this kind of behavior in the future. They're also conducting an internal review of all officers to ensure that they're held accountable for their actions." The man sat in silence for a moment, absorbing the news. He felt a sense of closure, but he also understood that the work wasn't done. Change had begun, but it would take time for the full impact to be felt. Still, he felt hopeful. He had taken a stand, and that stand had made a difference. In the weeks that followed, the man continued to speak out. He was invited to local community events where he shared his story and encouraged others to hold those in power accountable. Slowly, he began to see the impact of his actions. The community was beginning to heal, and people were more willing to speak up about injustice. It was a long road ahead, but for the first time in his life, the man felt like he was part of something bigger than himself, a movement that was working to make the world a better place.